Hello, my name is Dr. Dominic D'Etorre, and I am professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And today I will be presenting to you on analogy. So, beginning with words and their meanings. Sometimes words have two meanings. We see this happen all of the time. It means something different to say that a dog barks and a tree has bark. It means something different to say that a time has a length and a day has a length. So this prompts us to be thinking about what does it even mean for a word to mean? And a key notion that Aristotle gave to us for thinking about words' meaning is the notion of signification. So Aristotle taught us that words signify things or natures through the conceptions that our intellect forms about those things or natures. And so when I say that a dog barks and a tree has bark, I'm using the same word, bark, but I'm using it with different signification through the concept or conception that my intellect forms of the surface of a tree. I am referring to the bark on the tree, and through the conception that my intellect forms of the sound that a dog makes, I signify barking about a dog. So, from having these two different conceptions of bark, I have my two different meanings of bark, and the technical term for having the same word with two different meanings is equivocation. By contrast with equivocation, we can talk about univocation, and that's when you have the same word used with the same meaning about different things. So if I'm talking about two different dogs and I say those dogs bark, if I say Fido barks and Spunky barks, well, in that case, I'm using the word bark univocally. Or if I were to say that a day has a length and an hour has a length, well, I'm talking about two different lengths of time. I'm using length univocally, in contrast to if I were to talk about the length of a day and the length of a table, where it seems like I'm using the word length with two different meanings. Now, this sets us up for another way of thinking about words and their meanings. We've talked about already that we can use the same word with the same meaning and the same word with different meanings. But it's also the case that we can use the same word with partly the same meaning and a partly different meaning. And that what takes us into thinking about analogy. So we can wonder, why does it even matter that we use terms univocally, equivocally, or analogously? Well, it matters because we actually want to use words to communicate with each other. We want to be able to learn things. And in a science, we even want to prove things. We want to be able to get generalizable knowledge. And the great thing about using words univocally is that if we are saying something that is true about one thing, everything that applies to that one thing will also apply to everything else about which that term is said univocally. So, for example, if I am saying that barking is a sound that alerts humans, well, that applies not just to the dog Fido's bark, but that applies to every dog's bark. If I discover that barking is a sound that alerts humans, I don't have to think, well, this only applies to the barks that I've heard. I can actually discover that this is a property or characteristic of barking that applies across the board, and I can expect it to happen for the barking of any dog. Now, if I were to reason, barking is a sound that alerts humans, trees have bark, therefore trees have a sound that alerts humans, well then I would have made a logical error. Then I would have gone from using a term in one way to using it in an equivocal way in an argument, and then I would have made an error in my reasoning. That particular error is called the fallacy of equivocation. Univocity, or univocal use of words, secures our reasoning. It keeps us from making these kinds of mistakes. And when we're engaging in reasoning with each other, we want to clarify how we're using our words so that we would avoid equivocal use of our words and secure as much as possible univocal use of our words. But this sets us up for thinking about, well, what about analogy? Is analogy going to be able to give us that security in reasoning that univocity gives us? Or would analogy lead us into this fallacy of equivocation? Now, this is an encyclopedia about Catholic theology. You can wonder, what is special about this issue for thinking about theology? Now, Catholic theologians and philosophers have historically taken the position that we do not use our words univocally about God and creatures. And we also don't use them merely equivocally about God and creatures. If we were to use the terms univocally about God and creatures, that would mean that there was something essentially the same about God and creatures. That in some way we would have the same kind of nature as God has. Like dogs all have the same kind of nature, which makes it so that they have the same kind of bark, which is why the bark of all dogs alerts humans. And humans have the same kind of nature, which makes it such that we are alerted by the sound of a dog's bark. But God is so different from creatures that if we were to, in fact, to have the same kind of nature as God, we would end up being God. And in the history of Catholic theology, it is emphasized very strongly that we are not the same kind of being as God. Going in the other direction, if we were to say that our words merely apply equivocally to God, these words that we learn from our experience of creatures, then it would turn out that it would be impossible to learn about God from our experience of creatures. Anything that we learned about a creature wouldn't apply to God. Just like we can't learn about the bark of trees by studying the barks of dogs, we wouldn't be able to learn about the goodness, the wisdom, or the being of God by studying the goodness, the wisdom, or the being of creatures at all. So it seems like we can't be using our words univocally about God if we're going to have theology, and we can't be using our words merely equivocally about God if we're going to have theology. That takes us to, well, can we have analogy? Will analogy give us what we need to be able to talk about God in a scientific kind of way? Now, in the next section, Analogy and Scientific Discourse, I talk in the article about the challenge of using analogy to be able to secure natural theology as a real discipline where we're not trying to say that God and creatures actually have the same nature when they don't. And we're not making the arguments of natural theology, or even revealed theology for that matter, mere metaphors or completely falling prey to the fallacy of equivocation. Now, it's not as easy to secure a demonstration using analogous terms as it might appear to be when you just say, well, it's either univocal or equivocal or analogous. It's not univocal, it's not equivocal, therefore it must be analogous. Because analogy also seems to present certain kinds of difficulties. So I mentioned in the previous section that fallacy of equivocation, where you reason from what a word means applied in one way to drawing a conclusion by using that word in a different way. So if I were, again, to use the previous example, to say, barks alert humans, trees have bark, therefore trees have what alerts humans, I've committed the fallacy of equivocation. But what if I were to use a word analogously? Would I just avoid the fallacy of equivocation? Well, the standard example of the fallacy of equivocation in the old medieval logic textbooks goes like this. everything healthy is alive. Medicine is healthy, therefore medicine is alive. Now you can see that that's obviously an absurd form of argument, because clearly medicine isn't alive. But what have you done there, though? You've taken the word healthy as applied to, say, an animal or any kind of living thing, where healthy means something along the lines of the parts are functioning in a well-ordered way so that that being can carry out its life, to using healthy as it is referred to the health of medicine, where healthy means that it causes health in an animal. That is to say, it causes that right order or function in the parts of an animal. Now, these two uses of the word healthy are analogous, and in fact, they are the basic example of what it is for a term to be used analogously in the medieval authors. And even going back to Aristotle, it's a basic example of a term that is used with different but related meanings about different things. So it seems like you can't just say, well, the word's used analogously, therefore we're going to be fine for our arguments and our demonstrations. We won't fall into the fallacy of equivocation. Now, there's another way in which we use terms analogously, and this is where the terms refer to something that is proportionally the same in the different things. So you've got two different things. They don't have the same kind of nature. They're not specifically the same. They're not even generically the same. But there is some kind of proportionality between the two things. And so for this, I'll give the example I used earlier of length, or refer to the length of time and the length of some kind of space or magnitude. The length of time isn't the same kind of thing, even generically, as the length of a magnitude. But there is a kind of proportional similarity there. So you could say that as a second is to an hour, so a centimeter is to a meter. Or to use some more of the classical examples that show up in the writings of Aristotle and the medieval authors, you can say that a foundation relates to a house in a way that is proportionally similar to the way that a spring relates to a river. And that's proportionally similar to the way that a point relates to a line. And that is proportionally similar to the way in which a ruler relates to a kingdom. And that, too, is proportionally similar to the way that a first principle of a science relates to the conclusions of that science. And about all of these different things, we can call them principles. We can call the foundation of the house a principle. We can call the point a principle of the line. We can call the premise a principle of the argument, and so on and so forth. They have different but related meanings, referring to the way in which there is a proportional similarity. To use some other examples to try to illustrate the point, we can talk about a knife being sharp, and we can also talk about a note, like a musical note, being sharp, and we can even talk about somebody's wit being sharp. Well, there's nothing even generically the same about the sharpness of a knife, the sharpness of a note, or the sharpness of a comedian's wit. But the knife relates to what it is that it is cutting in a way that is proportionally similar to the way that that note relates to the one who is hearing the note, and the way in which the comedian's joke relates to the person that that joke was directed at. So we have at least these three proportionally similar ways of being sharp. Now, in the history of debate about how you can have valid reasoning using analogous terms, major figures have typically pointed to analogy of proportionality as the kind of analogy where you can give the argument using the term analogously, moving from what we know about creatures to what it is that we know that's proportionally similar in God. and then this way avoid falling into the fallacy of equivocation. And in the article, talk about what are some of the possible pitfalls of taking that approach, but then also what are the ways in which you avoid that pitfalls and are able thereby to actually give a valid argument using the terms that have proportionally similar meanings. Let's say they're analogous by the analogy of proportionality. The last main section of the article is on analogy of being and the Antichrist. Now, I've mentioned so far that we're effectively trying to avoid two different problems in using words to talk about God and theology. One problem would be the problem of univocation, where we're effectively saying that God and creatures have the same kind of nature, and thereby making God and creatures too similar. The opposite problem would be to say that we're using the words with completely different meanings. We do avoid making God too similar to creatures, but in taking that approach, we make God too unlike creatures and make it so that we can't actually learn anything about God at all. The words that we use to talk about God wouldn't really mean anything. Now, there's a tradition of saying that we really do want to say that God and creatures are completely unlike, and that when we use words to talk about God, we really only want to say that we are denying or negating about God the things that belong to the creatures. This is a tradition that's called apophaticism. Now, in the 20th century, a major figure named Karl Barth, he presented what we could consider to be an extreme form of apophaticism. And he thought that in any kind of talk about analogy of being or analogy between God and creatures, that we would be making creatures to be too much like God. And speaking very rhetorically, he said that the analogy of being is the Antichrist, or the work of the Antichrist. Now, this isn't the kind of article for seriously engaging the arguments of Barth for the nuance that they truly have, or giving the whole context for his position. What I do want to point out, though, is what are the actual metaphysical commitments that you are making if you are to hold that there is analogy between God and creatures. So the central commitment that you're making in maintaining analogy between God and creatures is that there is some likeness between God and creatures, but it's not a likeness where God and creatures share in common the same nature. There's not some single nature that belongs to God that also belongs to creatures. Like, say, there is a single nature of humanity that all humans share in, or even a single nature of animality that all animals share in, or a single nature of living that all living things share in. What we're committed to, though, is that there is some less than generic similarity between the nature of God and the nature of creatures. Now, the basis for the similarity between the nature of God and the nature of creatures is that God is the cause of creatures, that an effect must in some way resemble its cause. It doesn't have to have the same kind of nature as its cause, but since the effect derives in some way its being from its cause, it must in some way be a reflection, however distant, of the being of its cause. Now, one of the ways that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this is to say that when we use our words to talk about God, we negate and we also add eminence. So we negate the limitations and the imperfections of what it is that we're going to say about God, and then we add eminence or excellence to it. So just to give the standard example that St. Thomas gives, when we say that God is wise, Well, we take away the particular features of wisdom that belong to the wisdom of a creature. So, for a human being, wisdom is a quality, and even an acquired quality. Not all humans are wise. Well, for God, God is wise essentially. It's not something that God has to acquire. It's not something that God can lose. Wisdom is part of God's nature. So we negate that when we say that God is wise, wisdom being a quality that can be acquired by something or lost. Also, for humans, wisdom is something limited. No human is infinitely wise, but there's no limit to God's wisdom. So we add the notion of being infinite when we think about God's wisdom. So you can say, when you're thinking about what metaphysical commitments you have when you are saying that God and creatures are analogously wise, you're not saying that they are even the same sort of thing. To be a quality is a different sort of thing than to be something that belongs to something's very essence. And likewise, to be infinite is to be a different sort of thing than to be something finite. So we're not going to confuse God's nature with the nature of creatures when we are using our terms analogously to speak about God and creatures. We're in no more danger of committing an act of idolatry when we say that God is a being or God is wise than we are in danger of thinking that we are going to move across the room if we just sit here long enough when we use the term length to speak about the length of a time and the length of a space. The perspective that I've given in this article comes from a particular Thomist perspective. For someone who is interested in studying this further, you would be interested in looking up the debates between Thomists over what I've called analogy of proportionality and what can be called analogy of attribution. An excellent entry into this debate is the work by George Kluber-Tantz called St. Thomas on Analogy. That work is also an excellent introduction to the series of other debates about how to interpret St. Thomas's position on analogy, debates about whether his position evolves over time. Certainly recommend it to you as entryway into thinking about what are the different ways in which somebody could understand even just St. Thomas himself on analogy. Many great later works. Another one that I would recommend to you for thinking about the set of texts of St. Thomas on analogy is Father John Whipple's book, The Metaphysical Thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. We're looking at the broader issue among Catholic and especially scholastic authors. You would want to look into the debates between the positions of Blessed John Duns Scotus, who does argue that being is said univocally about God and creatures, and the figures in the Thomist tradition who were responding to the thought of John Duns Scotus and thereby developing the understanding of analogy in the Thomist tradition. Major figures in that debate include the great 16th century figure Thomas de Vio Cajetan. Much of the debate that happens later is either developing, responding to, and somewhere criticizing the position of Thomas de Vio Cajetan. If you look into the 20th and early 21st century debates among scholars of the thought of Thomas Aquinas on analogy, it's basically a debate between those who think Cajetan was onto something and those who think Cajetan messed everything up and got things completely wrong. For an excellent introduction to that debate, I would refer you to Joshua Hochschild's book, The Semantics of Analogy. For a broad introduction to analogy and debates over analogy, I could also refer you to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article, Medieval Theories of Analogy. Thank you for your attention. For more information, please see my article on ect.org. Thank you.